Well, in this video I want to talk about another topic that kind of emerged or has emerged in discussions with socialists. This is not from a recent discussion. These are the same comment wars that I had with Miss Sexy Socialist and a number of other anarcho-syndicalist types now almost 2 months ago. And I think I referenced in some of my earlier videos there's so much is brought up in those topics that you really can't address them all in a single video, and so this is one of the major topics that comes up, and I hadn't specifically addressed it. And that is addressing the argument among many anarcho-syndicalists. Not all socialists generally, typically statist socialists don't use this type of argumentation, but the anarcho-syndicalists very often do. And that is the appeal to consensus. And consensus is like several other words that anarcho-syndicalists kind of have this very, very deferential attitude towards, to the point that they simply cite the word, and that in and of itself is apparently seen as adequate justification for whatever it is they're talking about. Now, the most common word that I think has this position in their ideology is democracy. People will just say, well, it's democratic, hence it is justified, moral, advisable, whatever. Sometimes they'll say socialist, but I think socialist has such a radical kind of tinge to it that even people who are socialist shy away from using it in such an offhand way. But definitely democracy, and that's been addressed by lots of other people. I don't even know how many videos about the fallacies of democracy, because if you look at democracy, there's no reason to assume that it's a good system, that it's a workable system. There's certainly nothing to say that would make it seem deontologically correct. You know, that the idea that something is democratic doesn't make it moral, to the extent that we won't even want to have a morality. Certainly does not have much going for it in terms of utilitarianism, and there are obvious and clear theoretical and empirical reasons why it is prone to abuse. And this is the one thing I think that they really overlook, because there's this kind of view that it would just, our system would be so much better if only it could be more democratic. But there is no reason to conclude that a democratic system would be one that is without corruption or problems. In fact, I think it's safe to say that the rational ignorance and the moral hazard that we have in our society, much of it is actually due to democracy, and if we were to have more democracy, we'd have more of this. Consensus is less common than democracy, but it's another one that is similarly used. And I'll just say, in my debates with Miss Sexy Socialist, and she's not the only one, but she's the one who's coming to my mind right now, there's, you know, I would always raise concerns about, what about the minority? What about the people who don't agree? And she was quite, you know, kind of put off by this and thinking that I was basically attacking a straw man, or this was a non sequitur, because her entire premise is that in the society that she's advocating, an anarcho-syndicalist one, there is going to be consensus-based decision-making. And now my understanding is that consensus meant, you know, basically a large majority of people agree on something, and that it was a noun, and it described a state of understanding. And that is one of the definitions. Now, there are others, apparently, and she was using it more as a verb, as a process, the consensus process, which is not a usage that I don't think that's a very common usage. I have never used it in that way in speech. I've never noticed other people to use it in that way in speech, except socialists. And I think this is kind of interesting, because these socialists' main critique of libertarianism is to be basically lexicon Nazis about the word, and to say, without debating any of the issues or anything, just to say, well, historically in the 19th century, libertarian meant, you know, anarcho-socialist of some type, or anarcho-communist. Hence, libertarianism is, you know, invalidated or fraudulent or something. Even if we were to concede the debate on the etymology of the word, it wouldn't say anything in terms of the efficacy of the policies that libertarians are talking about. And I think it's a little ironic, although I guess it's defensible on their part, that they would have this definition of consensus that most people don't understand. You know, when you say libertarian to most people in the Western Hemisphere, they know what you mean, and they mean like a Rothbard, Ron Paul, you know, Gary Johnson. That's what libertarian means. It doesn't mean Bakunin or Ben Tucker or Noam Chomsky. It means like American, to say, well, it's only what Americans. Americans is a big part of culture. I mean, so outside of the anarcho-syndicalist community, consensus has a meaning that is basically a large-scale agreement. Now, I personally have never thought of it to mean explicitly a unanimous opinion. So otherwise there'd be no point in having the word. So unanimity means every single person agrees. Consensus is one step below that, which I guess unanimity could be called consensus, but then there are oftentimes things that are called consensus where there isn't unanimity. Cliched examples would be like evolution or a heliocentric solar system. There's consensus on those topics. The vast majority of people, the vast majority of qualified people, maybe all qualified people, depending on how you qualify it, you know, believe in evolution, at least macroevolution. They believe in a sun-centered solar system. They believe, hence the name solar system. I mean, they believe in plate tectonics and that sort of thing. But there are people who don't believe those things. But people will still say, well, there's a consensus that evolution happened, you know. And that can't mean unanimity, because unanimity would mean every single person agrees, and there clearly isn't that. So in debating My Sexy Socialist, my argument has always been the utilitarian one as well as a moral one, although I'm not real comfortable making moral arguments, that there are questions about individuals and minorities, how they'll be treated, can't they be run roughshod over, and isn't there moral hazard involved in that? Isn't there a utilitarian argument that the coercion of minorities in the name of a majority, isn't that a problem? And this was kind of, I got an indignant response that this is silly because there would be consensus. Well, that would only be true if by consensus she meant unanimity. And I agree. If everybody agrees on something, there's no dispute, there's no point in even talking about the ethics or the morality of an issue. If every single person in the world wanted the Venus Project, believed in the Venus Project, would submit their entire existence to the fulfillment of the Venus Project or whatever other wacky socialist utopia you're imagining, then there's no disagreement, there's no question about what should or should not be done because everyone's already agreed. I, for one, though, think that's an absurd basis to assume. It's just silly to assume everybody's going to agree. And so I'm worried about the infinitely, or if not infinitely, nearly infinitely more likely scenario where there is not unanimity. And since I think that's a much more realistic scenario, I think that's the one that we should take more seriously and the one that we should use as the basis for constructing the worldview. To look at some of, now I'm going to point out some of my qualms with consensus-based decision making. If it is the way Miss Sexy Socialist and other socialists talk about it is basically we all discuss whatever it is that we're whatever there are disputes. Whenever there's a dispute, we discuss, and we discuss it with everybody that's involved. Now, the degree that you're involved in the socialist worldview is one that where literally everybody on the planet would probably have, or would plausibly have a claim to having some say-so in it. You know, every breath we all take, every use of every finite resource, and of course all resources are finite, has an effect literally on everyone else in the world, even though that effect is quite minuscule and perhaps not even measurable much of the time. So who exactly has a say in an issue is not something that is clear. If we're, I mean, hypothetically, it could include literally every single person for literally every single decision, no matter how small, no matter how big. Certainly big decisions. You know, are we going to dam a river? Are we going to build a canal? Are we going to build a large factory that's going to emit gases into the atmosphere that could be considered pollution? That's something that, and of course there's like literally millions of those. Those are issues that clearly could be viewed as worldwide consensus requiring. Miss Sexy Socialists and other socialists, I think, try and get around this by saying, well, we're going to have localism, we're going to have local polities, and I had serious questions about that. How are those designed? There's a strong incentive for gerrymandering to occur, whereby how you draw the political units is going to have an extremely large impact into how, you know, what gets decided. So if we can gerrymander it in such a way, we can basically get any result we want. And since these units, I mean, if you're going to have democracy or voting or consensus, who gets to have a say is going to determine beforehand what is actually going to get decided. And it's actually very difficult. You can't resolve this through consensus. If there's, you know, one person who says, hey, I'm my own polity, or me and my friends are my own polity, then there's no, you can try and persuade them, and if they never agree, then you're either going to have to coerce them or you're going to have to accept basically infinite secession. And if that's the case, then there's no way to think about, well, there's all going to be these little polities everywhere. Miss Sexy Socialist is an idiot because she just thinks it's naturally obvious what the electorates, and I say electorates, she would say it's not elections, they're consensus, but I can't think of a noun description of the political units based on consensus. The consenting polities, I guess, is her idea is that it's self-evident. I think that's just absurd. New York City is self-evidently a city, but you know, its urban area sprawls far beyond New York City. Even within New York City, there are innumerable areas that may or may not be considered subsets or independent sets of it. I mean, there are various islands, there's various boroughs, and on and on and on. I look at it, I don't see any clear, obvious, even on islands, and I think the most obvious one is a geographic island, presumably one with a small population. Even there, you can take questions. You look at like East Timor. You know, East Timor is not a huge island, but it's got distinct major ethnic groups that hate each other and have tried to wipe each other out, at least one on the other. I don't know all the details about that. So we can look at the map and be like, oh, obviously East Timor should be its own polity, but it wouldn't be so obvious, and that same can be said just about everywhere. I mean, there are little tiny islands in Lake Michigan that have 400 or 500 people, and yet they're not homogeneous, and they have different characteristics, and there are major rifts in who, you know, some of them are Norwegian settlers and some of them are Native American settlers, and you know, their religious beliefs and their economic positions are totally different. And to just assume that, oh, well, there's a natural, obvious political unit on which to base consensus decision making is not clear. And if we're not having some dictator, you know, just declaring where these lines are, they can't really come to them through consensus unless there's unanimity. Again, if everyone agrees, then yes, obviously. If every single person in the world agrees about every other polity, then yeah, there's no debate. But I think that's just a silly assumption to have. So that's one problem with it. Another problem is that there is no, again, I don't think there's a problem if there's unanimity. I just think that's a silly assumption. The only way to distinguish it, if you're just assuming unanimity, then you should just say everything's going to be unanimous, in which case you're evidently a fool. And then we have to decide if it's not unanimous, well, how much consent is necessary for it to be consensus? You know, if 95% agree and 5% don't, does that mean the 95% can do something, whatever they want, to the 5%? And this is a question that I think is an important one, but that the socialists tend to dismiss as it won't arise because this is consensus-based. Now here's some practical, I mean, if everyone agrees, I don't have any problem. But here are some practical problems with this. And I just saw a Frank Zappa quote about a month ago. And I always known Frank Zappa was a libertarian when it came to free speech. If you look, he is someone who has, in the past, campaigned against suppression of free speech. His music has been targeted by the government. They would label it basically obscene. Even albums of his, and he has made albums that I guess were kind of racy, but I think there was at one point he actually came out with a racy album in some way. I haven't listened to very much of his music. He's well known for giving his children strange names. Anyway, he came out with a new album, and it was a jazz album. It had no lyrics at all, and it got labeled as like mature, you know, inappropriate for children by Tipper Gore or somebody. And so I always knew that, but I just saw a quote from him. See, communism will never work because people like to own stuff. And he's basically onto something right there. There's a reason that this consensus system is not workable, because everybody has their own ideas of what they value, what they want in life. And they work towards those ends. They have ends, they employ means to get them. And not always, but almost always, those ends, the things that people want, the things that people desire, require property. They require material goods, and for those ends to be reached, and it could be anything. It could be just having a nice home. It could be raising kids. It could be traveling. It could be possessing certain goods, like you like to hunt, so you want to have a bow and arrow. It could mean you're a sculptor and you want to have statuary and a kiln. It could mean you like to paint, so you want to have painting implements. It could be you want to be a writer, so you want to have writing implements and you want to have a lot of books. I mean, the list is nearly infinite. I mean, there's a finite amount that's written, but there's no line beyond which it can't extend any further. And because of this, people are not going to welcome a system that throws into doubt their control of property. Now, there's never certainty. There's always the possibility, no matter what proprietarian system we have, whether it's communist, whether it's anarcho-capitalist, there's always the chance of something happening and ruining your plans. We can have the ideal system, however you want to call that, and a meteor could strike, or there could be an earthquake, or society could change, or you could change. I mean, you could have, say we have anarcho-capitalism, and you want to, your dream is to fly in an airplane, and you spend all your money, and you have an airport, and you have your own private jets because everything would be cheap and everything. And then you change your mind, and you suddenly want to become a submariner. And as it happens, that's just not possible for whatever reason. You know, oh, that sucks. But the consensus-based system is much more uncertain than a proprietarian one. So this is a utilitarian argument. So again, there's no moral question if there's unanimity, and there's no point in even debating it. But people work towards ends, and many of the things that they work for take years and years, and nobody wants to submit their plans for the future to more interference from others than is necessary. And the consensus-based system has no theoretical limit to the degree to which others can interfere, alter your plans. Now, for now, let's just ignore the fact that literally everyone on the planet would have some claim to interfering with every allocation of resources, no matter how minute. And let's just assume for now that there are these consenting political polities, and that you're a member of one, and you know, it would be arbitrary to pick a number. We could say 1,000, we could say 100, we could say Dunbar's number, whatever we want for how big this polity is. If you ask the anarcho-syndicalist, well, what is the proper scope of the greater society? What is on the table in terms of what can be consented? And this is the same when you ask them about democracy, is they simply defer to the word. So they say, well, we'll let democracy decide this. This is a complaint that they raise against anarcho-capitalists, and say, well, they just like to say the market will take care of it. Well, there are reasons. Maybe that's a simplistic way to answer a question, but there are, if we work out the market process, it's not just appealing to some vagary, you know, in human thinking. There's a process to how markets work that describes this, but it's similar in that they just say, well, democracy will take care of it, consensus will take care of it. What that in effect means is that the scope that can be settled or controlled by consensus decision making is up to that decision making process itself. It has no scope. You know, it's like saying the government gets to decide the limits of its own power, which is just another way of saying its power has no limits. What this means in effect, and just by talking to them how this process would work, is they tend to just assume that, well, because most socialists are like this, they think, well, you can have your personal property, but things that are more than that, that has to be the community, society, democracy needs to have a direct say in that. And but where they draw the line between personal and public is always arbitrary, never scientific, and usually just reflects their own personal biases. You know, so some of them think you can't have a 3-car garage and 100 acres and a and a Lamborghini, and others think you are only entitled to a barracks, a hammock, and whatever shitty health care the government decides you're entitled to. But in the consensus-based system, let's say that we all have our own homes and we have our own plots of land, and of course the factories are run by everybody, and let's just assume we're not all starving or whatever. If my neighbor decides that he covets something that I have, there's nothing to stop him from bringing it up in the consenting process. And to say, I think that the society should appropriate whatever it is, my car, part of my land, all of my land, my house, part of my house, my labor, whatever. And that's not to necessarily say that they're going to get what they want, but now the political unit has to address this concern. It can't summarily dismiss it. If it could, then you're not talking about a consenting system. You're having some kind of oligarchy, some kind of supreme secretary, very likely, who is actually really running the show, which I think is what this would probably end up actually being. But unless you're going to have some kind of board or whatever that's basically running everything by deciding what gets to be voted on or not, every whim of every person needs to be indulged, at least some. It has to be brought up for debate. And this is another practical problem, even if we're talking about a small unit that is spending no time interacting with outside units, which is silly. But if it's just focusing on itself, on its members, the number of decisions that are potentially debatable and potentially taking up the decision-making process time is infinite. I mean, it's huge, and the process itself is extremely slow, and most of the time. And if consent is unanimity, which is the basis of the argument that what are you worried about the minority? There won't be a minority. Everyone will agree. Then your one pissed off neighbor is not going to change his mind unless there's an absolute shit ton of persuasion. And if your neighbor is a really persuasive person himself or herself, then they may even be able to directly expropriate from you, even if most of the people in your polity really don't care. That silver-tongued individuals do exist and are capable of doing that, as history has demonstrated more times than anyone can count. So the business of government, the business of this consenting organization would be astronomically huge. It would be everything. The socialists tend not to. They have a pretty expansive view of the scope of this civil society within the lives of individuals. There are no socialist minarchists really, and so we would be in the position where we would have to spend all of our time decision making and none of our time actually doing anything. And even doing that, we would be unable. We would be victims of rational ignorance. There's no way I'm going to know about a property dispute between two of my neighbors. And this is where I say, if I have a property dispute with my neighbor, he wants my car, he wants part of my acreage, or he wants my house to be used in a certain way, that's a dispute between me and him. And it's not clear to me how third parties who are only indirectly and only very slightly affected by this need to have a say, or that they need to take any part in it. By including them in the circle of the dispute, we've just complicated matters enormously. he and I have a dispute, so he and I need to resolve it. And the quickest and easiest way is for the two of us to discuss it. If not, we should take it to an arbiter, either just a judge or maybe a jury system, or maybe our company, our dispute resolution organizations, as some people like to say. But that would be much simpler to say, okay, everybody now in our political unit, and again, that could be 100, 1,000. I mean, practically, I think it would have to actually be almost everybody. But and now, society grinds to a halt as we have a debate about my rose garden. And it's not clear how my other neighbors, how their vote, and this is interesting. They call it the consenting process, but when it gets down to it, it is an electoral process, a voting process, one that aims for a supermajority or the most, or even everybody. And again, if everyone agrees, it's not a big deal. But we're going to be debating every little thing forever, not doing anything. And this, of course, slows down all other activities. People aren't going to invest into capital and property if they realize it's going to be at the whim of others, potentially even. I mean, right now you can invest in capital. Like there's still, there could be a flood, there could be a fire. The government might confiscate it. So there are disincentives, and that prevents some capital formation and some wealth creation. And people, if you don't like the idea of capital, of wealth creation, of satisfying human wants, whether your own or others. If we have a system where anybody anywhere can raise an objection to anything anywhere, at least within the political consensus unit, then there are infinitely more, or at least a hugely greater number of potential hurdles, and that's a disincentive, plain and simple. There also is the incentive to try and expropriate from others, because you can manipulate the crowd, be persuasive. In the end of the day, you could say, okay, let's just compromise. I'm demanding, half your property because I want to build. I think that the society should build a sidewalk there. It just happens to be a sidewalk in front of my house or whatever. And so let's compromise. And instead of all the acreage I'm demanding, just give me half, and then we won't have to debate it forever. And then we can have consensus around a compromise that aggrandizes my needs over yours. Or we can be bogged down in a decision-making process. And I heard one of my commenters said that they attended one of these Occupy Wall Street protests, which is the one area where you'll kind of see this in the United States, although I don't know how common it is. And that they had somehow collected donations worth about $200,000. People had put in jars or whatever. So this is money that they had at their disposal. I don't know what this organization was to be receiving donations, but the idea came out that they should use this money, some of this money, not even all of it, to repair the drums. There had been drummers there who had been, drumming and chanting or whatever, and they had damage done to their drums. I don't think maliciously, just through the process of working. And the idea was, let's give them this money so they can, or enough of it to repair their drums. And they tried to work this out through consensus voting, and after several hours, they could not decide what to do, and nothing was done. And that's a pretty mundane example, but since the scope of what's to be decided includes not just the exceptional things like huge factories and the position of major industries, but everything. I mean, every mundane little thing is potentially an area of intervention. The practical effects of this is just crazy. And again, people don't want to submit their ideas, their will, their plans to any more influence than they have to. Again, there's no certainty, so we can't have a system, whether it's anarcho-capitalist or anything, where you can be sure that if you put your savings here, it'll be there. But the more hurdles you place to that, the less incentive there is to even try. And so there is no incentive to work if your peers can just unilaterally decide that they want to have access to your resources, to your plans, to your hopes and dreams. And even if you can thwart them through the consensus process, you could also lose in the consensus process, and you have to spend the time to make the effort to even do that. And again, for everything, for what kind of toothpaste you're having, to what kind of clothes you're wearing, to what kind of cars you're driving, to how you're spending your time, to whether there's lighting at night, and what kind of power, blah, 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 blah. It's a wholly impractical system if you even accept most of its premises. You know, the only one that you can't really accept is that everyone unanimously agrees, in which case it doesn't even matter what kind of decision-making process. There's no point even having a decision-making process if everyone agrees. So, and this is why I just have such a dim view of socialists, because if you just look at the system that they're talking about and, you know, forget, you don't even have to come in there with all these doom and gloom about socialism equaling Stalin or whatever. It just wouldn't work. There's no way that we have the time to do this. And, you know, we're rationally, I mean, a classic example is like the president. Here, we don't have pure democracy in the United States. But we have a government that has plenary, far-reaching, not all unlimited, but far-reaching power. And the president of the United States is essentially running the government to one degree or another. I know that's kind of debatable exactly what their role is, but it's an extremely important decision, right? Who the president is. And yet the vast majority of people are utterly ignorant about not only the personalities of those seeking the office, but their policies, their histories, their philosophies. Utterly, utterly ignorant. So they're not, and the idea that, well, they don't know who the president is or what his policies are, but they're going to know the best type of shoelaces their neighbors should have, or whatever else. And again, the scope of potential topics is like almost infinite. There's going to be rational ignorance an unbelievable degree, unless you're going to have some kind of hurdle that's going to dictate what can and cannot be discussed. In which case, whoever's setting that hurdle, whoever the secretary is who's saying, listen, I know you don't like the shoelaces your neighbor has, but they're just things we don't have time to listen to, so we're not even going to discuss that. Then that secretary is Joseph Stalin now. All right, they have the power to basically decide what is and what is not up for debate, and that would then be the power of life and death. It's like the power of tax is the power to destroy. If you have a consensus-based system, the power to decide what is even debated and what is not is the power to destroy. And Miss Sexy Socialist has even come out. You know, I brought up well, why should, you know, people who have relatively nothing at stake, why should they have equal say to me? You know, if we're talking about my labor, my property, my car, you know, my land, why should strangers, or, you know, even if we're talking about the 100 people in a polity, why should they have equal say? And she, at first, and this is another problem with votings that I've brought up a couple times, you know, just with a one person equals one vote just does not make sense in almost any context other than an explicitly voluntary one. So like 10 of us could say we're going to form a corporation and we're going to vote when we have a decision. Then the voting makes sense in that situation. But we want to take your lunch money, let's vote on it. No, that doesn't make sense. So her response was that you have say in proportion to how much it affects you. I've heard other anarcho-syndicalists say you should have a vote equivalent to how much it affects you. Of course, how much it affects you is totally debatable, and you can't vote on it if that's the very thing. You know, if I say, well, I'm 60%, you know, and 60% of the vote should go to me, and you say, no, only 10% of the vote should go to you, we can't vote on that to decide. And it's not evident ever, really, you know, what exact ratio it should be. So we're going to have some person specializing in the society who's going to assign a relative value to somebody. Then that person is the Stalin, or that committee that does that is the Stalin. They're the ones who get to decide how much your vote counts. Now, Miss Sexy Socialist, and I thought that's where she was going, but she said, no, it's not a voting. They're just going to decide how much you get to speak. So the idea being your vote, and this is it, your vote doesn't count anymore. So if my neighbor wants to take my land for his own use or for the use of the society, I get the same say as everybody else. But what Miss Sexy Socialist thinks is, when we debate it, I should have more time to speak. Again, how would we determine how much time I speak? Should I get all the time? What if I think I should be the only one who speaks? But why, just being able to have the opportunity to persuade, but then to be subject to what is essentially an electoral process doesn't make any sense. I should have more say than other people, even if I'm allowed to speak more. And if you're going to, and there is the question of who's assigning the speaking time, then that person is kind of really powerful and influential. Not very egalitarian, that's certainly the case. So I guess you could say we would, in the lead up to every debate, every policy debate, there would be a pre-debate of deciding how much speaking time the various parties involved should have. And then we've just doubled the length of time necessary to basically come to decisions. So these are obvious, like to me, these are just easily evident, issues that need to be addressed, and they're not, because socialists are emotive and they like to just, oh, consensus, oh, democracy, it makes me feel warm and fuzzy, blah blah blah, and that's why I just really can't take them seriously. So, all right, that's it.